Luigi, why don't you start?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
please.
here we go. All right, colleagues. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Luigi de Munnik. I'm the Regional Boss Coordinator and Regional Admin Officer for DCO. I am based in Bangkok. Today I'm joined with a bunch of other colleagues. Hold on. Let me introduce to you, first of all, two colleagues from my team, or the team that I work with. It's Zamir Frotan. He's the global lead for the business operations strategy. Also, behind the back end is Luis Diego. Uh, uh, he is also joining our team, and he is actually spearheading this initiative where we promote high impact common services. We are also joined with so-called external panelists. We are joined by Gopal Mitra. He is the Senior Social Affairs Officer of the Disability Team Executive Office of our Secretary General. We are also joined by a colleague from UNICEF, Marco Mendez. He is the lead of diversity and inclusion and HR specialists in UNICEF. Also joining us today is Facundo Chavez Penias. He's the Human Rights and Disability Advisor, Thematic Engagement, Special Procedures and Rights to Development Division of OHCHR. Did I miss anyone? I see also Brianna. Brianna, I don't have any intro for you. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Brianna Harrison. I'm a Human Rights Policy Specialist at DCO in New York, and I'm also the Disability Focal Point.
Fantastic, thank you. Before we start, a few notes on housekeeping. Do we need to change the slide? No, not yet, sorry. Housekeeping, so I'll be handling the mic, so to speak, and giving it to the panelists back and forth. If you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box as the webinar unfolds. Please be reminded this webinar is being recorded, and we are going to share this recording with everyone that has registered for this webinar. I'm also being asked to refer to practice notes that have been created for these common service solutions and which will be made available as a handout during this meeting. At the end of this meeting, we'll be also sharing a short feedback form, an online form, with which we would like to solicit your feedback because this helps us get a better idea how to tailor our webinars and guidance and support and that sort of thing. All right, the slide here, it's the brief agenda of the webinar. So first of all, we're going to discuss the intro to high impact services. Secondly, we're going to tell a little bit more about the United Nations Disability Inclusion Strategy and the accountability framework as laid out by the Executive Office of our SG. Third point, we are going to take a look at common service solutions and how this ties into disability inclusion. And we also have a Q&A session, is what I understand. Then we will hear the perspectives of our colleagues from UNICEF and OHCHR on disability inclusion. And to top it off, we are going to have a free-flow Q&A session. All right, without much further ado, what are high impact common services? Okay, common service solutions under the BOSS. As you know, the business operations strategy is all about location dependent services, and it tries to capture our collaborative effort in terms of business operations at field level. So high impact here means potential for high cost avoidance, a potential for quality improvement. There's a certain linkage with one of the or multiple of the 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN. I guess more on that in a later slide. And everything is based on good practices as captured through our OMTs across the world and agencies. Sorry, I'm juggling between two screens. Please forgive me. So the objectives and benefits of trying to scale these high impact common services is to, we use the BOSS as a standardization of these common service solutions on the approach and how to implement monitoring, reporting, etc. Of course, as the last slide indicated, it has a high impact for both cost and quality. So we're really looking to use these service solutions to maximize cost avoidance and improve quality. Quality here, I would like you to take a little bit of a wider view to the term quality. Quality here means also making service solutions available to a wider range of UN entities that beforehand would not be able to afford it. Let me quickly digress. Procurement, for example, if you have a very small office with 3 international staff, if that office needs to procure a procurement process, you do advertising, TORs, advertising, bid solicitation process, and you do that all by P4 or P5, it's going to be much more costly than when you can take this procurement and farm it out to a lead agency with a much larger staff. So the point here being is that with quality improvement through the BOSS, we are trying to make these service solutions available by sharing. As I said also, we have the data to support a system-wide approach to this and scale these good practices. Skip one. Overview. Okay. I think now I'd like to hand over to Gopal Mitra. Gopal, over to you, please.
Hi, everyone. Actually, Gopal and I are doing a bit of a tag team. And so today I'm going to speak about the disability inclusion strategy. Sorry to confuse you, Luigi. And we have Gopal and also Georgia Dominic from the disability team in the EOSG on the webinar. So I'm sure that we will have an opportunity to hear from them later in the Q&A. And we also have Amy Farkas Karageorgis here, who's the disability expert who's been working with DCO. So behind me is a big team of experts who are supporting this work, and I'm just the face of it today. So hi, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm the disability focal point in DCO. And welcome to the webinar. Great to see you all. Could I have the next slide, please? Persons with disabilities are a very significant part of the population. They are 15% of the population, in fact. So it's important for us to remember that, because when we think about the type of workplace that we see here in the UN, and also when we're reminded of our agenda and our mission on human rights and inclusion, we know that we have a long way to go to ensure that persons with disabilities are not only part of our programming, but also part of our operations and our workforce. And that's why these BOSS services are so exciting. They provide the opportunity for us to really scale up and significantly improve our record in some of the fundamental aspects of operations. So we're going to be focusing on that today, as you know, but just to give you a little bit of a broader background, I wanted to just give you an overview of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy for those of you that have not heard of it already. It was launched by the Secretary General in mid-2019. It covers both policy programs and operations, and it consists of a policy and an accountability framework. And the accountability framework has two aligned components. One is an entity accountability framework, so each entity of the UN. And the second is more of a sort of a horizontal accountability framework, which applies to UN country teams. And many of you may have already been involved in this process late last year when every UN country team completed for the first time the UN country team accountability scorecard on disability inclusion. Both of these components have specific indicators and they are complementary. They're not the same, but they are, they're designed for, to take into account the different roles of UN bodies, both at headquarters, regional and country level, and the overall vision of the strategy. And together they comprise an accountability framework that we hope will really help to ensure that the strategy is implemented. And of course, the purpose of that is to really make a difference in the lives of persons with disabilities and to ensure that the UN is really at the front in terms of its work with persons with disabilities. The disability inclusion strategy is modeled on the gender swap, which also some of you may be familiar with. It's been around for a few more years. And it has synergies with other corporate strategies, including the youth strategy and the system-wide action plan on Indigenous persons. Next slide, please. So under the UN country team accountability scorecard, this slide just gives you an overview of what's included. There are 14 indicators overall, which cover the sort of full scope of the disability inclusion strategy. So you see that the indicators are clustered around 4 core areas. They are leadership, strategic planning and management, inclusiveness, programming, and organizational culture. And then under each one of these core areas, there's a number of more, specific indicators which each have benchmarks for progressive scoring. And so under leadership, strategic planning and management, we're looking at leadership, strategic planning, which is essentially the CCA, the cooperation framework, and the UN country team setup and coordination mechanisms. Under inclusiveness, we look at consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities, the accessibility of UN premises and accommodation, and inclusive procurement of goods and services. Under the programming side, we look at joint programs, data, M&E, and the humanitarian preparedness. And under organizational culture, we look at employment, capacity development for UN staff, and communication. And through all of these indicators, we are trying to identify the critical areas where action is needed to improve on disability inclusion. The indicators on accessibility, procurement, employment, and capacity building are, of course, critical from the operations side, which is where you all come in. For each indicator, there are benchmarks, as I said, on a progressive scale, and UN country teams report annually through the IMS. So the theme of today's discussion is inclusive HR services. When the SG launched the disability inclusion strategy, he observed that the UN should be an employer of choice for persons with disabilities. To be an employer of choice, there are several actions that need to be taken. Specific indicators in the scorecard on employment of persons with disabilities are, of course, important, but they are not sufficient on their own to really promote inclusive workplaces and enable employment of persons with disabilities. So you all, of course, as experienced people in operations, will understand that we need to create an enabling environment. And the strategy aims to do that. So we have the elements in indicator 12 of the scorecard. I think we might need to go to the next slide. We have the elements in indicator 12 of the scorecard on employment, which look at, thank you, requiring a diversity statement that explicitly mentions persons with disabilities and non-discrimination. Looking at your vacancy announcements and ensuring outreach to persons with disabilities, and encouraging persons with disabilities to apply and ensure that they are aware of vacancy announcements. But of course, looking at the broader ecosystem, we also need to think about some of the other indicators, such as accessibility. If you have a person who uses a wheelchair who wants to work in the UN, then the premises, of course, need to be accessible. And if you were a person who is blind, then we also need to look at the IT infrastructure and the digital infrastructure to ensure that that is accessible. There are also considerations relating to reasonable accommodation, which ensure that we're able to address the specific requirements or adjustments that might be needed for a person with disability so that they can work on an equal basis with others. So these components are all covered in the indicators that I mentioned above. And in addition, it's important for us to think about raising awareness on persons with disabilities and engaging with organizations of persons with disabilities, both through our external outreach and thinking about the benefits of having persons with disabilities within our staff, and being mindful also of staff that have family members with disabilities, which is also mentioned in the strategy. So, just to conclude, I guess when we think about what an inclusive UN workplace would look like, we need to be aiming for 15% of our staff as persons with disabilities. That's representative of the broader population. Of course, not all persons with disabilities have a visible disability, so it's not like that necessarily you will see 15% of the other staff in the office necessarily having a disability, but that's what we need to be aiming for, to be an inclusive environment where all types of people and persons with disabilities in all of their diversity are able to work in the UN, and we really look forward to creating a more enabling environment for that through these BOSS services. Gopal or Georgia, please add anything if I've missed. Thanks.
Thank you, Brianna. Nothing more to add.
Thank you very much, Brianna, for introducing the disability inclusion strategy, as well as the scorecard, the UNCT scorecard for disability and its linkages to the business operations, and in particular to the human resources, and how to ensure that we have an inclusive human resources from a disability inclusion perspective. Colleagues, I just wanted to remind you again that we have a great team of experts in disability inclusion with us today. So please feel free to raise your questions in the chat box, as we will have very limited time to have an open mic session. And the colleagues in the background will either respond to the questions right away, or they will group some of the questions so that our experts could get back to you. Now that you have the broader understanding of the disability inclusion from the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy perspective, as well as the requirements of the UN scorecard, that what is expected of the UN country teams, we want to take a dive into how can we make the UN operations accessible, and how can we basically make it accessible collectively or collaboratively. And for this, we have a number of webinars. We have three areas basically that we are focusing right now. Physical accessibility, that is basically focused on the accessibility of our buildings and premises. ICT and digital accessibility, which will be focused on our digital platforms, websites and all. And then inclusive HR, that's basically the core of all, and ensures that we attract and we basically recruit and retain persons with disability as equal good capacities and great capacities of the UN's biggest asset, as it's staff and personnel. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this, Luigi. Just to let you free, I'm going to take over the slides from this end so that we can change it as we go. Let me just go directly into what do we expect from colleagues to do collaboratively in UN country teams and operations management teams in order to improve the disability inclusion in HR. So colleagues, in the business operations strategy, we have already identified certain common services that links to disability inclusion and links basically to making the human resources practices as a starter. Some of the UN human resources practices inclusive in terms of disability inclusion. Obviously, you can consider other inclusion or inclusiveness in the UN, including gender and all that you would already be working on. But our focus today is on how to make the recruitment and engagement of the UN more accessible or more inclusive from a disability inclusion perspective. So this is basically the 5 areas that we'll be focusing on how to identify and engage persons with disability or engage with disability experts, organizations of persons with disability, and how to map basically disability inclusion in our existing HR practices, providing orientation to our staff and personnel so that they are aware of the disability inclusion strategy, as well as the expectations from them in order to ensure that there is adequate, reasonable accommodation for our colleagues when they join us or when they are working with us in any capacity. And at the same time, in order to attract more and more persons with disability, how to ensure that our career fairs and job fairs and events where we're attracting new talents to the UN as part of our talent acquisition steps or initiatives, how to ensure that those initiatives are actually accessible to the extent possible, to the extent practical for whatever country that you are going to be in and working with to make those career events more accessible and to provide basically the opportunity for persons with disabilities to be able to join your career fairs or talent acquisition efforts and be able to get oriented through the recruitment process of the UN. And the end goal is basically to ensure that the UN gave the same and fair opportunity for persons with disabilities to join the UN and be part of our great team in any of the countries. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail in the process. You will be receiving practice notes on how to ensure that you can work collaboratively and make the HR process or HR practices at the country level, those activities that are actually in your control and not necessarily policy-wide or corporate decisions, make them more accessible. We're working very closely with our colleagues at the headquarters as well, with the high-level committee of management, so that a lot of disability inclusion, harmonizations will be introduced as part of the policies of the HR and in the UN system as well. But these initiatives, colleagues, can be basically identified, can be initiated under the authority of your UN country team and as an initiative of your operations management team, part of the BOSS. It doesn't necessarily require an approval from your headquarters because these are already practices that are recognized by the UN. It's part of your UN disability inclusion strategy and your scorecard of the UN country team. So you can easily start collaborating together as UN jointly and work with the persons with disability, with organizations of persons with disability and other disability experts in order to ensure your HR practices at the country level is more inclusive. So There is detail on this. The very first and most important aspect is to identify and engage with persons with disability and organizations of persons with disability and or disability experts in your area. So that you know what are your baselines? What are your baselines? How many persons with disabilities do you have in your own organizations and collectively in the UN system in your country? And then what kind of platforms are out there so that you could attract and communicate with persons with disabilities? Obviously, those that would like to voluntarily disclose their disabilities and would like to be recognized in that aspect. The second part is to look into the HR practices that you have right now, from your requirements or needs assessment all the way to your talent acquisition, to the process of your recruitments, be it having your job descriptions or vacancy announcements posted in a more accessible manner, to ensuring that your written tests and interviews are more accommodative, more accessible. So a person with disability, if they disclose their disability, could be basically given the accommodations needed to ensure that they have enough time or enough, depending on what kind of requirements do they have the opportunity to ensure that they have been given a fair approach in terms of their written tests and interviews, so that at the end of the day you could basically have these talents assessed properly. You don't need to bend the rules. You don't need to go through any exemptions or waivers. It's just to make adjustments in your process to make it more accommodative, make it more accessible. If there's a person that would require certain accessibility in order to join your interview process or written test processes, you should be able to provide those accommodations as part of your recruitment process. The third common service that we are proposing under the BOSS, and it is really, really important, is to ensure that time and again you would have orientation to your staff and personnel. As UN, widely, like openly for all of the UN staff in your team, in your country, or even for your agencies, you need to ensure that you provide orientations on disability inclusion and reasonable accommodation to your colleagues, to all of the staff in your agencies and in your country. If you do not have that type of, let's say, expertise in country, you can always reach out to us. We have this great team of experts with us who has a really wide network of experts in different countries. We are also working with various organizations that can support us voluntarily to provide orientation to UN staff on disability inclusion and reasonable accommodation, so that all of your staff actually, not necessarily only on operations, but beyond operations and program and all, and coordination, they have the understanding of what is disability inclusion, what is expectation from them as colleagues of persons with disabilities, and what is the overall expectation from the UN staff, being a UN staff, and ensuring that they are colleagues that have the understanding and respect and the accommodation for persons with disabilities. So orientation to staff, very easy but very important, is one of the common services that we strongly recommend under the BOSS. The other areas are you have been probably doing either corporately through your headquarters or individually by your agencies or jointly through the UN system. I mean, we normally and obviously recommend joint accessible UN career fairs or job fairs at the country level. This you normally do as part of your HR strategy to attract new talents, to ensure that you have good new talents joining the UN for your new vacancies, for your new posts. We want to just inject in that. We want to make sure that you make those joint UN career fairs accessible. And making them accessible may not be very, very difficult. maybe you need to ensure that a venue is selected that is accessible for persons with disability who may be walking in with a wheelchair, so that it's not like on the 10th floor of a building that doesn't have an elevator. It's really easy, basically requirements, accommodations that you can consider, that basically your events are held in accessible places. There are accessibility devices if there's an issue with hearing, if you need to bring like an expert who will need to basically make the event more accessible in terms of depending on any accessibility that you could basically find accommodations for it. Our request is to make your UN career fairs joint career fairs and accessible career fairs, so that you could basically attract as equally as fair the persons with disabilities as you do for the rest of the target groups that you have in your mind and in your strategy. And at the end of the day, what all these could basically lead to is to recruit, onboard and retain persons with disabilities in your organization. Obviously, persons with disability have the same, let's say, level of talent as we all have. There's no discrimination in that. There's no difference in that. There might be needs for accommodations. We all need accommodations, even if we don't consider ourselves disabled in any form. We do need accommodations at certain points. It's just that it's not tagged as a disability accommodation. But apart from that, we all have basically the opportunity of growth, the opportunity of learning, the opportunity of contributing to the work of the UN. So hiring persons with disability in our organizations in all contract modalities, as personnel, as staff, as interns, as consultants, is what we are trying to ensure, so that this group, like all other groups that we want to ensure to be in the UN, are given the right opportunity to join us. Going a little bit more practical in terms of a business operations strategy, and how can you ensure that these common services are basically included in your business operations strategy for collaboration. For those of you who are familiar with the business operations strategy, you know that we have a process where we call it stock take and opportunity analysis. This is the time where you need to basically look into what kind of disability inclusion services do we have in place in our agencies right now, either collaboratively or just in our agency, as part of what we just explained in the slides before. And then if you don't see any of them, or if you see some of them with some of the agencies, but you see that there is an opportunity to expand this and scale this throughout the UN system in your country, that's the greatest opportunity for you to ensure that the disability inclusion common services are included in your BOSS as part of your stock take and opportunity analysis. And then in your planning framework, where you will be implementing basically agreed collaborations at the country level, you need to prioritize. I mean, we highly recommend that you prioritize disability inclusion common services on the top of the services that you would like to start with in terms of collaboration. This is one of the most important targets that the Secretary General of the UN has set for all of us. This is humanitarian. This is ensuring that we give the right and the most appropriate, fair opportunity for all persons with disabilities, as we would give to other groups. So let's ensure that our recruitment process are accessible, and then we will be, of course, talking about the premises and digital accessibility as well. And its implementation is the most important part. You don't, we will be talking in various groups and various webinars about how to ensure that you operationalize your business operation strategies and make it actually implemented. So it doesn't end up that you basically plan inclusive HR in your strategies and you never implement it. But having a defined activity and a defined timeline in order to implement your disability inclusion services at the country level will be the most important part of the work that you will be doing as well. and ensuring that that's very visible to your UN country teams when you're presenting your business operations strategies for sign off and their review, and as well as capture that in your reporting that, let's say, country A or B have had this baseline for disability inclusion, and in a year or two we have improved it, and we have engaged persons with disabilities in our organization, or at least we have attracted and we have made it possible for persons with disabilities to be able to go through our process as fair as possible. So this is our pitch, colleagues. Some of the colleagues in the previous conversations and previous webinars that we have had on high impact common services asked that, oh, if you're recommending these common services, can you also give us some funding with it? So this is a good question, colleague. What we are doing as part of high impact common services, we're trying to identify the most impactful services where you can do collaboration, where you can collaboratively work at the country level. It either gives you cost efficiency or quality efficiency, or it will have a significant social impact like this. But it doesn't mean that we always come with a pot of money as well and say, if you're recommending this, here is the money and here's the fund, go and implement it. That is the ideal situation. We are working, I have to say, we're working with various potential partners to help us and provide us resources, either in terms of funding or experts, so that they could help you in implementation of these inclusive initiatives at the country level. But at this stage, we don't have any particular fund to support it. That funding will need to be discussed with your UN country teams. Your UN country teams are aware that the implementation of disability inclusion strategy is a priority for them, and cost sharing will be available, and hopefully will be available. We will be able to help you discuss this with your headquarters if necessary, to ensure that the financial issues and funding should not become basically a bottleneck toward the implementation of these services, particularly collaboratively, where basically the portion that your agency would be paying will be peanuts, rather than you having this implemented jointly, independently, apologies. But as soon as we have some funding in place, obviously the agencies will be informed. I would like to also remind you, I mean, some of the countries are already working on the program side in promoting disability inclusion in the communities as part of the UNPRPD initiative. That Brianna is going to maybe unpack that for you in the chat and maybe share the link. So if your country is part of the UNPRPD initiatives, maybe you could also talk to your program colleagues and see if there's an opportunity that you could submit a proposal as part of your program implementation for disability inclusion in the operation side as well, to make your own offices and your own processes more inclusive too. Just wrapping it up with this slide, colleagues, that the common services that are in the BOSS related to the disability inclusion and particularly to the HR are already tagged as recommended common services in the BOSS platform. There are practice notes that will guide you on how to approach this, what to prioritize, how to ask for support if needed as part of those practice notes and these dedicated webinars. And we have this dedicated expert support with you. So at any point of time that you are in the process of planning or implementing your disability inclusion services, feel free to reach out to us, or reach out to your BOSS coordinators in the region or this group, and we will make sure that you have the support you need. If you, a lot of countries have already developed their BOSS, so it doesn't mean that if you have already developed your BOSS, you don't need to think about disability inclusion now. No, you can always start your work on making collaborations, on making your HR practices more accessible, and then as soon as you get into your boss review, you can include these in your business operations strategies, or even before that if there is a business case for it. But if certain countries, I think we still have like 10, 15 countries that are developing their boss. If you're hearing me today, please do consider disability inclusion common services in your boss now, so that you could implement it throughout the year. So let me stop here and hand over the floor back to Diego to see if you have some questions before we go to some experience sharing from our colleagues from UNICEF and OHTHR. Over to you, Diego.
Great, thank you, Samir. Hello, colleagues. There is one question regarding whether this has already been done in UNCTs before. Have these services in this format been implemented already?
Okay, I would say that the common services identified under the business operation strategy has not been presented in this format to the UN country teams. But the UN country teams have been briefed as we do the briefings for the UN country teams on the efficiency agenda. We highlight the high impact common services within which the disability inclusion is already there. But I would like to also hear maybe from Brianna if on how wide the overall disability inclusion has been briefed to the UN country teams, because these are interlinked as part of the greater disability inclusion and scorecard for the UNCTs. Over to you, Brianna.
Thanks, Amir. Just to say the disability inclusion strategy has been rolled out fully. All of the resident coordinators have received several messages regarding the importance of implementation of the strategy at the country team level. And as I mentioned, all country teams were asked to participate in the process of doing their first completion of the scorecard late last year, which includes questions regarding the indicators that touch on the operational work. So it's out there. Of course, not all country teams were able to report specific actions under some of these areas as yet. We understand that it's a process that we're all working together to move forward. So some of these areas may be where there are very few UN country teams that have actually taken those steps forward, and that's partly why this initiative to try to provide you with more guidance and access to experts that have done this kind of thing before in their entities is so helpful. Thanks.
Great, wonderful. Thank you so much. If it's okay, I'd like to hand over to Marcos Mendes from UNICEF to speak a little bit about the experience on the ground. Marcos,
Thank
if you're
you,
there,
Luis.
the floor is yours.
Yes, do you want me to share my screen, or are you sharing the slides?
Yes, if you'd like to share and handle the slides.
Okay,
that would be great.
just a second. Let me know when you can see something.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, let me see. I need to go to, I think it's 29. Sorry, it's taking a little bit long to load because I think the presentation is quite heavy. There you go. Let me see if you can see the cover slide of UNICEF.
Yes.
Oh, okay, cool, perfect. So yes, thank you so much for inviting UNICEF to this webinar. I apologize on behalf of Shirin, our colleague and disability specialist who couldn't make it today. It's 3:30 a.m. for her in Vancouver, so we thought that it was better that I represented the diversity and inclusion team at UNICEF. Let me just go to the next slide. So I'm not going to talk about UNDIS because that has been covered already, but I hope that I might be able to respond to some of the questions that were raised in the chat in terms of examples on reasonable accommodation and a few others. So this is mainly what UNICEF has been focused on over the last year and a half to 2 years, since a little bit later than UNDIS was approved. We have focused on building a very strong reasonable accommodation policy, and not just policy, but also a very simple and streamlined request mechanism. So colleagues can request reasonable accommodation very quickly, very fast, with the ideal level of confidentiality, and also with an understanding that that reasonable accommodation is a given and not just something nice to have for an entitlement. We have also focused on policies to attract, recruit, and retain employees with disabilities, and I'll get to that in the next slides. We also have focused on the inclusion of persons with disabilities. We have done a lot of webinars on stigma reduction and the like, because we have noticed in surveys that persons with disabilities at UNICEF report slightly less satisfaction and motivation than other employees. And by the way, I'm going to refer to employees the whole time and not to the staff, because I'm talking here about the staff and non-staff. All our policies and provisions on disability inclusion apply to, except those related, obviously, to entitlements like the UN Pension Fund and all that. All applies to, including reasonable accommodation, all applies to staff and consultants, interns, UNVS fellows, etc. And we have also focused on increasing the number of employees with disabilities at UNICEF, and I will get to that in a second. So this has been our response since since late 2019 to the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. So we have a disability focal point based in New York, Shirin, that some of you know because she has been involved in a million UNDIS webinars already. We have also set up disability focal points in every region. They don't have only HR or institutional responsibilities. They also take care of some programmatic responsibilities, but they are the ones that at the end of the day roll out our different policies and HR practices. And they are the ones who we use also as a sounding board to see if such policies are relevant for regional context as well. Then, as I mentioned before, so we have not just revamped the request process of the Disability Accommodation Fund for reasonable accommodation. We have also increased the amount that we have annually. This is still a fairly low amount. We had $50,000 up to 2019, and from 2020 onwards, we have $300,000 globally annually for reasonable accommodation. This includes accommodation for current employees and also accommodation for applicants. Accommodation for applicants by default, I believe it's maximum of $500 per person, but we are being quite flexible depending on the country where they are. If someone needs, a personal assistant, for instance, it's not the same in New York than in Gabon, obviously. So we are quite flexible also with the way that we approach that. We also have a new disability inclusive HR procedure, which covers the whole employee life cycle, and I'll get to that in the next slide. Also, we have also worked on disability self-disclosure on our talent management system for applicants, and I get to that in the next slide in more detail as well. We also have a Green Accessibility Fund. This is from, I think, 6 years ago, so it's quite old in that sense. It predates, in fact, the UN Disability Strategy. And this is basically a fund that we had that for every trip that anybody basically paid at UNICEF, there was a percentage that went to this fund for basically office refurbishing, both based on accessibility and on environmentally friendliness. So this right now with COVID, it has been kind of depleted because not many people were traveling in 2020. So we're looking into alternative ways of funding this in the short term. But yes, that's the situation right now. And then very important, we have two networks of what we call employee resource groups, ERGs. The network of employees with disabilities, which started in 2019 with just 5 or 6 people and now has almost 60 people. And it has persons with mobility disabilities and visible disabilities, but also a lot of people with invisible disabilities, including mental health issues, as someone said also in the chat. This has been incredibly helpful for HR because whenever we have a new policy, for example, now the new rotation policy, we check with this network. We have a few conversations with them. They express their concerns, their needs, etc. And it's being, again, incredibly helpful to really understand, the priorities of persons with disabilities, and also another network of employees with children with disabilities. Also super interesting because there are things that we in HR, we just don't get, when we're doing policy, if we don't consult basically with the people who are being affected by it, right? At the end of the day, it's about the disability motto, right? Nothing about us without us. So let me go to the next slide. And I'm going to go here in detail about 2 points. One point is about self-disclosure. So yes, we have included a question on self-disclosure in October 2020 in our talent management system. We are now slightly rephrasing the question to make sure that applicants better understand it after piloting during a few months. But basically, we are a pro-disclosure organization for sure. We are not asking only for reasonable accommodation. We're also asking people, obviously, all this is voluntary, right? We're also asking people to self-disclose the disability voluntary, and also their type of disability, also voluntary. And why we are doing that? Well, first of all, because reasonable accommodation, we think it's a kind of westernized term that not many people understand in certain countries per se, and also because reasonable accommodation might refer to some people to, accommodation based on religious needs, based on other needs that are not necessarily disabilities. So we wanted to make sure that people self-disclose as well. So that then, and this gets to the second point around recruiting employees with disabilities, we have a new policy that says that if an employee who discloses his or her disability meets the eligibility requirements of the vacancy announcement, this person must be shortlisted. So again, this is not full affirmative action because we're not talking about, hiring people based on their disability identity, but we are talking about giving them a foot in the door, which for us is super important because there's, again, a lot to do on stigma reduction at UNICEF, and I'm sure in other UN agencies is the same. So for us, it's extremely important that we try to level the playing field with a few actions, at least in the short term. And then we also have, as you can see there in the second point, we also have a lot on vacancy announcement, making sure that they mention reasonable accommodation in the vacancy announcement, and also the different accommodations that are provided depending on the office. There's a lot of people here from UN country teams, right? So you know that in many UN buildings, in many countries, we don't have elevators, they're not accessible. So, and sometimes UNICEF shares those premises with other UN agencies, and there's not much we can do. But we think, we need to be honest, basically, right? If we don't have an elevator, we need to say in the vacancy announcement, so we're making sure that the candidate also comes with the right expectations. That doesn't mean we shouldn't work to increase accessibility, as we're doing through the fund, as I mentioned before. But in certain cases, it will happen that that in the short term, at least, we won't have an accessible office, and we just need to make sure that we say it. And then again, I made some comments there about the network rotation considerations. This is highly discussed with the employee network because not everybody is willing to rotate or able to rotate, basically. And also around employee retention. And we study a little bit the trends as well. Now that we have more disability self-disclosure data, we try to study the trends by gender, by level, by location, etc., to better understand what are the main concerns, and the main career paths of persons with disabilities. I also want to share, because someone asked in the chat about, well, two things. First, we are going to have a target, hopefully, for the next strategic plan, which goes from 2022 to 2025. We hope to have a target of 7% of persons with disabilities at UNICEF. We depart from a very low baseline of around between 2 and 3% right now, but this is not fully accurate data. This data comes from our global staff survey, which has a very good response rate, but still, obviously, it's voluntary self-disclosure, and not everybody responds anyway to the survey. So until we have better data from our ERP or from the talent management system, we are going through the global staff survey. 7% responding to a comment in the chat. Yes, we are accounting for gender parity. For sure, I agree. In the World Report and in many other reports, it says that women have faced double discrimination if they're women with disabilities. Right now, we have parity. I think we have, in fact, 55% women, but we need to take into account the levels as well. And in fact, we have more men with disabilities in higher positions than women with disabilities. So that's what we want to address as well. And we will also have regional representation, 7% again. That's the aspirational target for 2025. And we hope to have 15% by 2030 for the next strategic plan. And then I just wanted to share this slide just to make sure that because we have, part of the work on stigma reduction is also around, let me go back. It's also around entrenched beliefs, right? People who are not exposed to diversity, inclusion, disability inclusion, etc. They think that people with disabilities are people in wheelchairs. We've seen this very often at UNICEF. And particularly, and this is quite interesting, particularly in HQ locations, people think that in the field, since there are in certain countries, especially in post-conflict countries, there are many more people who have visible disabilities, but not necessarily wheelchairs. People understand even better what disability means. But this is just a mapping of like some colleagues, right? High-level colleagues that we have with disabilities at UNICEF who have self-disclosed disabilities, and we have from representatives, so basically top leadership in certain countries, to chiefs of different things, and also to make sure that we all understand that this is not just about hiring people to work on disability inclusion in programming, but to work in any type of position also with their disability identity, right? So, and just to finalize, I'm going to stop presenting some examples of reasonable accommodation that we have at UNICEF over the last few months. So non-cost examples include flexible work. Now it's more of a given with COVID, but it might be that in the future it's not anymore. So flexible work is a big one, and not just working from home, but also flexible working hours, staggering working, etc. Now, accommodations with costs, we have sign language interpreters, we have personal assistants, we have ergonomic furniture, specifically depending on type of disability. This is very contextual to the person. So we have a lot of different types of, we also have screen readers, right? We have a lot of different types of accommodation that we provide to both applicants and employees with disabilities. So yeah, over from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcos. That was so helpful and informative. I know we're almost coming at an end. We have shared a feedback form link so that you can provide your feedback. And I would also like to address some of the questions. I know Facundo Chavez, disability expert in OHCHR, is on the line, and I wanted to address a question to him. Facundo, if you're there, one of the questions was, what are the main barriers of implementing disability inclusive HR processes and practices? Over to you.
Hi, colleagues. Thank you. Yeah, I think there are a few items that we have to have in mind. The first one is that we have to assume that we're still living in a context where persons with disabilities are considered that they are unable to work, right? So in taking that in mind and to overcome that specific barrier, it's very important to have a few clear items in mind when we are making a recruitment process and onboarding a person with disability. The first one is to have a very clear picture of what is the person going to be actually doing, and that the job descriptions and that the approaches in terms of defining the core functions of the job are very well defined, right? And that objectivity, let's say, in that description will help us to better provide the support that the person may require, and to overcome that incapacity to work perspective, right? We have seen that blanket assumptions on what person with disabilities can do, and for example, what Marcos was saying, that we have this blanket assumption that persons with disabilities are people in wheelchairs, also limits the way that we prepare ourselves to provide for support services. And it's very important to be very flexible in this sense. And that's where reasonable accommodation comes to play a very key and very strategic tool to give a space to the individuality of each person that we are recruiting, and to make a space for that person to actually engage in the recruitment processes and later to be part of the teams at country level. And there is a variety of reasonable accommodations that may be required. It can vary from IT and to have screen readers, for example, in the computer, or in furniture, to have desks that can be adjusted in height for people that may be requiring to be standing a few hours a day, or may not fit with their wheelchairs or with the assistive technologies in the spaces that are given. Two more broad aspects, much more connected to accessibility, like ramps or elevators, as it was referred to before. So to have these points in mind at the moment of engaging in the recruitment process, it's particularly key. So this objective description of the core functions, what is the support the general support that the organization can offer, and then to have reasonable accommodation to be flexible to adjust to the requirements of people in those cases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Facundo. I'd like to hand over to Gopal Mitra. Gopal, if you're there, if you would like to give any remarks before we conclude.
Thank you, Luis Diego. It was a very interesting discussion. There are many questions which many of them we could not address because of lack of time, but we'll try and see if we can add in this chat some responses. There was a question at the end, how do we know, how can we identify persons with disabilities from the applications? At this, we are in touch with HR. At this point, there is no self-declaration question. We are discussing with OHR. At this point, the main thing is that what we are encouraging and what we see becoming increasingly common is that in the diversity statement, in the vacancy announcement, if it is explicitly mentioned that persons with disabilities are encouraged to apply, you will have a larger pool of applicants with disabilities. In some of the PHP or the P11 or the forms that you have, there is a question on which say that do you need any adjustments to perform your work, any accommodation or any adjustments to perform your work. Some of the applicants would include it there. That is one way, not a perfect way. And when we have seen that if you are encouraging applications from persons with disabilities, some persons with disabilities would choose to mention it in the covering letter and so on. So these are the two ways at this point, not ideal, but we are also, because there are questions of confidentiality of information and so on. So we are in discussion whether there can be a self-declaration question optional in the P11 or the PHPs that can help us get this information. There was also a question on mental health challenges, and what is the difference? Facundo has explained, and some colleagues have explained about reasonable accommodation. In terms of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which is the main guiding framework on the rights of persons with disabilities, it says that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term, and I want to emphasize the word long-term physical, mental, now it is called psychosocial, the term psychosocial is preferred, intellectual or sensory impairments, which in interaction with the barriers in the environment, we spoke about barriers also, prevent full participation of persons with disabilities in the society on an equal basis with others. So yes, it does include mental, psychosocial impairments, long-term, that is what the convention says. People with temporary impairments are at this point are not covered by the convention. For example, if you fracture a leg and you have difficulty in walking, some of the difficulties will be the same. But as we say, if we are promoting accessibility, all persons who have even temporary impairments will be able to participate better. But as far as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is concerned, the definition is, or the understanding of persons with disabilities is what I just mentioned. There has been questions on dependents with disabilities which have been covered. And especially what we have seen, issues of when we are talking about mobility, when you are talking about flexible working hours or flexible work adjustments. These are points which are particularly important for staff members who have dependents with disabilities, as well as access to services. When you are posted in a new place, if you have a dependent with a disability, you would like to know what services are available, to what extent, and employee resource groups and so on are extremely important in this regard. I don't know whether there may have been questions which have not been answered, but we'll be happy to include that in the chat at a later stage, because we could not answer all of them because of the lack of time. Thank you so much again, and I hand it back to you, Luis Diego.
Thank you so much, Kopa. That's so helpful. And I know there are many questions that may not be answered. We will answer them also on a follow-up email with frequently asked questions. Before closing, I know we're already past time, but Brianna and Zamir, if you would like to give any concluding remarks.
I just wanted to mention that I got a couple of messages from colleagues that they were not able to raise questions in the chat. Maybe the Teams chat would have not been accessible itself for all of our audience today. Please do feel free to send your questions to me or Luis Diego, or to whatever email that you have received the invitation from. We will be putting together an FAQ around disability inclusion in operations, and we'll try to capture those questions in the FAQ and revert back to you. The FAQ will be uploaded into the UN Business Operations shared drives, and that would be available and accessible to most of the colleagues, and will be updated from time to time. At the same time, as you could see, today we had OHCHR and UNICEF presenting on their successful practices in inclusive HR. Today, we're going to give the same opportunity for the rest of the UN agencies that have had successes in any areas of the high impact common services, in particular to the disability inclusion, be it in HR or in physical accessibility on your premises or in digital accessibility. So please do reach out to me if you see that, if you believe your organization has advanced these initiatives at the country level or at their headquarters level or regional level, so that we could get in touch with your colleagues and bring those successes forward, and make it basically an encouragement and an inspiration for the rest of the OMTs and UNCTs, particularly if there are good stories about disability inclusion in operations at the country level. That would be very good, very great. We'll give you the opportunity to speak up in these webinars, and also maybe some campaigns around this in our monthly newsletters and all. So with that, I just want to thank you all for being with us today, for joining us, and big thanks to our colleagues who has provided a lot of efforts in the background of this webinar, as well as in developing the practice notes. These practice notes will remain live. We look forward to your feedback. Please feel free to share feedback as part of the feedback form that you have received, and we will make sure that all constructive feedbacks are included into the guidance notes and practice notes, so that our colleagues could benefit more from this. Over to Brianna, if you have any additional points, Brianna, and then to the rest of the team before Luis Diego could close the session.
Maybe just one final point. I mean, firstly, thank you to all the experts that were on the line today. Really interesting discussion, and still obviously lots of questions for us to address. Just wanted to emphasize one point around consultation with organizations of persons with disabilities. This is a cross-cutting element of the disability inclusion strategy. Everything that we do relating to persons with disabilities should be in consultation with them. And we highly recommend that country teams identify organizations of persons with disabilities that they can work on, not only in the programming side, but also on operations. And they will also be able to provide you with a lot of expert advice in terms of how to go about rolling out some of these services in an inclusive manner. Over.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and thank you to all the experts. We look forward to staying in touch. We will send a follow-up email with the recording and all the resources, and look forward to helping you and supporting drive these strategies on the field. Have a great day, and we look forward to staying in touch. Bye-bye.
Thank you.